Peace be upon you. This is Way Stations, and my name is Rehan Khan. This is the show that looks at what does it mean to be human in the modern age, and we talk about a number of subjects, including religion and history and art and education. And I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Dr. Walead Mosaad. Dr. Walead, hello. How are you doing?
Rehan, how are you? Good to see you again.
Great to
Looking
see you.
forward to this session. I think it's going to be quite interesting, and I think it's something that weighs on a lot of people's minds, what they do with their time, right?
Exactly. So today we are talking about leisure time, or I think maybe in America, do you say leisure time? Is that what
We
you'd
say
say?
leisure, yeah, we don't say
Leisure.
leisure.
Okay, so I'll say leisure in the British way, and you can say leisure in the American way, and we'll work it out from there. But I
All
think the
right.
listeners will get what we're talking about.
Yeah, I hope so.
Okay. Well, look, what we're talking about leisure time, and I think it's something that if you look at the history of the early 20th century, particularly, economists predicted that we would be living in a time of great automation, and what automation and machinery was going to do, it was going to, simplify things for us. All the things in the house that you didn't want to do were going to be done, and your rituals would be taken care of, and all the boring stuff would be done. And suddenly we'd have all this leisure time. And many books were written by economists at the time about the age of leisure. But the opposite seems to have happened. we, Rather than having a lot of leisure time to actually reflect, and this is what they were talking about, that we'd have time to go inward. So when we had more leisure time, we could go inward, we could reflect, we could, go on this journey of growth and development. And somewhat at the time wrote that we would have more time to draw closer to God as well. But instead of that, we seem to be distracting ourselves with kind of frivolous entertainment, and we don't seem to have any time left at all. So, what would you say has happened in this regard, and how have we kind of ended up in this state where, we don't seem to have time? And what is leisure time, really?
I mean, I've been thinking about this, and let's say post-industrial revolution, or say pre-industrial revolution, I think you had more sort of independent, sort of discrete communities, and that was the age of the church, one room classroom, one room school, uh, local communities, and here we're talking in general, not just maybe in Europe or in the States, but I think a general trend was that there was much more local focus and community neighborhood focus, and people kind of did things their own way, and in a sense, the community was independent of, let's say, the larger picture of what's going on 1,000 miles away, or even the town down the road would be like, okay, I have to do a trek and get on my horse or get in my cart and go to the other town. And so I think people then were more close knit, and their activities obviously centered very much around fulfilling their daily needs, procuring water, procuring food, tending to their animals, husbandry, things like this. And obviously that took a lot of time. But I think there are a lot of social connections that were very strong that were also happening at the time. And maybe that was in the countryside. And then in the urban areas, you also had this sort of close-knit type of communities. You had guilds, you had, let's say in the Muslim world, you had masajid, mosques that people would be generally affiliated with. And then they'd have a sheikh or a teacher they'd be affiliated with, not necessarily like a student of knowledge, but someone they would see as their mufti, their sheikh, their mentor. They can go and ask questions. They can, have kind of sort of an affinity and allegiance to that particular scholar or that particular neighborhood and that sort of thing. And I think post-industrial revolution, a lot of that changed, and now we get into the era of mass production. And as many have commented, when you have mass production, then you get mass consumption. And then with the era of mass consumption, then we became somewhat more uniform in our tastes and our proclivities and in the things that we would, seek to do and desire. Then ramp that up to the information age and television And now you have a national pulpit, more or less, where people on a national level are tuning in basically to the same thing. And all at the same time, technology is progressing, right? So people didn't have to go by the river to wash their clothes. They're getting washing machines in their house. This is post World War II, obviously, when a lot of this happened quite rapidly, and industrialization and the building of new factories in the UK, as you're well aware of, and then many immigrants coming from India and Pakistan to work in those factories. And so this was kind of a new era of prosperity, at least from a financial perspective. And people were beginning to, I think, also build, and the baby boom and these sorts of things. So I think there was a period of time in there, from my study of history, at least from maybe the 1950s until maybe the beginning of the 80s, where you still had more or less kind of communities and social cohesion, and people still getting together face to face and having those connections. Maybe not the same as before, but they were still existent. Then when you get to the digital age, and now we have personal devices, and this is mid 90s, right, or late 90s, early 2000s. And you and I both, we lived through those eras, so we know about it firsthand. Um, then things began to change, and then people began to engage more with what I would say the commodification of their attention. Before, our attention was our own, and it wasn't seen as something that can be commercialized, except in a sense they want to sell you something, right? And then they get your attention to sell you that thing. Now we live in an age where your attention is the thing being sold. You can't walk into a store anywhere and buy something, except they want your phone number, they want your details, they want to add you to their marketing list, and then they're going to sell that marketing list to somebody else. And so it's this constant, I would, to be honest with you, I feel like it's an assault on our attention spans, and demanding that we give attention to these things, because by that attention has become commodified. And as a result, those who want to commodify our attention are looking for the most effective ways by which they can do that and capture our attention. Hence the age of Facebook and digital media and social media, and the dopamine hits that you get when you get a message, or you get an email, or you get a notification. And these are by design. These are not by accident. So as a result, then our attention span becomes completely focused on these little digital hits that have become shorter and shorter. Just as an exercise, ask anybody, watch a movie from the 1980s. After getting used to watching movies today, you're going to feel like it's in slow motion. Even the opening credits scene and the music and the landscape, people are like, wow, they'll fast forward, right? And I have to admit, sometimes I'll do that myself, because it feels kind of slow compared to the pace that we've grown accustomed to, and we've kind of been programmed to nowadays. So I think as a result, the time is the same, in terms of the amount of time that we have, but I think, as you alluded to, how we are spending it. And even if we look to the religious text, the prophetic hadith does say that amongst the signs of us getting closer to the last days is what's called taqarub al-zaman. And taqarub al-zaman means time feels like it's getting shorter. So some scholars have said it actually is going to get shorter, maybe in some dystopian future where the days will actually be shorter, perhaps. And others have said, no, not necessarily. It'll be our perception of it. In other words, this idea of barakah, or blessing, being able to do a great many things, or a great many useful things in a short amount of time. And I think this is what people are feeling today. But so, yani, the idea of leisure and using your time wisely and so forth, I think we have to give ourselves a little bit of a break about that. Because this is by design. And I know, Rehan, that you've spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I know you wrote a book called Distracting Ourselves to Death, and the time that people spend on their devices. And that one of the reasons that come up is that when people feel bored, they want to jump to the easiest thing, the path of least resistance. And that's the device to prevent boredom. So I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts are about that in particular.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I think, that's a really interesting history of how we've moved from the kind of industrial, agrarian, sort of slower time period where maybe you had more time for reflection, but of course you had to do a lot of your own menial tasks and so on, to the kind of digital frenetic age that we're in now, where it is very much about, okay, what can we sell you? So as you say, it's the attention economy, right? It's the attention economy. And we our information is essentially digitized and commercialized. So yeah, which would be, horrific before. People would feel absolutely appalled that that's happening, but now it's become very normal. So in terms of the question then that you asked me about, in terms of boredom, well, I think, when we spend our leisure time on our devices in the digital world, I think boredom sets in more quickly. Let me just repeat that. So I think when we spend our leisure time on devices in the digital world, I think boredom sets in more quickly. Now, let me explain what that means. So there was a piece of research done at York University, and they suggested that boredom is really the experience of you want to, but you're unable to engage in some satisfying activity. So you have a need, you want to engage in something, but you just seem unable to do that, right? And so, when we're not able to successfully engage our attention in terms of our inner self, so we can't engage our thoughts, we can't engage our feelings, or we can't engage with the external environment around us, the place that we're in, we often then attribute that, well, I'm bored. I can't engage with these things. I'm bored. And I think the bored person, they want to be stimulated, but they have what researchers call an unengaged mind, right? This is what it's called, unengaged mind. And just give a couple of data points for this, I think. There's one piece of research done by Nielsen. I think they looked at around about 4,000 participants, and they asked them, the main reasons for using a mobile phone app. And I think about 68% said they would use their smartphone when they were bored or they wanted to kill time, right?
Mhm.
The very word to kill time. I mean, time is sacred, right? But they want to kill time. And a similar study was done elsewhere, and they actually found that about in the UK, and what they found again was about 60% of participants in the study would prefer to use their devices than just to sit and think. So sitting and thinking is seen negatively, right? And actually, just being busy in your phone is something. And I think what's really at the crux of this is the very kind of the influence of very pervasive short time scale kind of reward cycles. Because what modern media does, it presents very short reward cycles. So basically, you get a ping on your phone, something pops up, right? And kind of the extreme example of this would be like a video game, right? Now, video games, especially those like on your mobile phone, say take a game like Temple Run, and I'm sure you probably haven't played that, but I haven't played it, but I've seen people play it. People are running in a kind of this temple, and they're trying to pick up these coins and things, and you're literally getting a reward every second. Every second, you're getting a couple of rewards, coins coming in. So what that does, that shortens the reward cycle. Because if you like read an article on a website, or you read a book, the reward cycle is longer. So the brain now in the digital world, due to these video games, and as you said, like in the movies, the scene keeps on switching all the time, right? The brain is becoming programmed to crave this kind of reward cycle, get something new, novel, flashy, and so on. And because of that, then when we encounter things which are slower, like a movie, like from the olden days, or you watch, or you read a book, then boredom sets in. Or even if you have to just sit and think, boredom sets in. Okay. So I think this is something which we're experiencing around us, because we're constantly being bombarded by tweets, texts, gamification. There's even a word now in well, it's been around for a while, but in the corporate sector, they're trying to gamify work, right, to make it more appealing, right? Or watching an endless supply of kind of cat videos that keep on, popping up all the time.
That's in education also they use that term to
Oh, is it?
gamify. Yeah,
Okay.
to pedagogically how to teach children by gamifying, English, math, whatever it might be.
Right, right. Okay, so there you go. So it's kind of it's very very pervasive. And so what it's all resulting in is that if we're not being stimulated, we start to feel bored. And so what we're doing is we're losing the ability to simply do nothing. Leave time for reflection, leave time for kind of deep thinking. So I think it's quite a serious thing, which I think is affecting a lot of us here today. And I think one of the things I'd be really interested to sort of get your thoughts on this, which is that I think today society tends to equate uh, anything that is repetition or maybe something that's routine with boredom, right? So we think, oh, I have to do that again or again and again, and we think, well, that's just going to get boring. But what are your thoughts about this?
That's an interesting question. And we live, like you said, in this kind of very hyper attention span seeking kind of environment. And the idea of doing something more than once somehow is equated with not being innovative or interesting or creative. Uh, and but the interesting thing is, you look at to what is done, let's say, in go back to movies, we're just seeing a lot of not very creative things and people rehashing what happened in the past. Actually, the reboot, right? The phenomenon of the reboot, whether it's the superhero movies or some other movie that was really great in 1984, and then they try to do it in 2025, and it's not exactly the same thing. And so, um, but what I think people fail to see or fail to realize is that by repeating certain things that are essentially uh, helping you to grow as a person, right? Because repetition, especially in education, I'm familiar with the idea of, what they call it rote memorization, and it doesn't create anything in the child. And now the teacher is not the teacher anymore, is more like the learning guide, the facilitator, and the child is teaching themselves and this sort of thing. And they want to move away from what they call the sage on the stage, which is where the teacher is doing most of the talking and imparting to the children, and rather the children is figured out themselves. And well, I'm not saying there's any kind of merit to that. I think there is some merit to that, but I think it's also missing the point in the sense that you need to have a certain level of understanding and built up ability to reflect. Even, I mean, you just mentioned that we don't have time to reflect. The thing is, people don't know how to reflect too. If you do leave them and say, well, they're gonna be like, well, what do you want me to reflect upon? uh People go to like I remember someone told me like Niagara Falls in Ontario, Canada, which I've been to a few times, and you look at the power of the water and how many centuries has that been going, or thousands of years, and it's like what we'd say a subhanallah moment. And then sometimes people go there like, wow, that's a lot of water there going down there. Wow, amazing. Like they don't even have they don't have the tools, let's say the intellectual or the spiritual tools within themselves to be able to reflect on something like that, because they haven't grown accustomed to it. So I think the idea of repetitive, let's say meditation, reading, um, everybody in the fitness world knows that if you want to have gains and improvement, you need to go 3 times a week to the gym, or whatever, how many times. If you want to master playing the piano, then you have to have X number of lessons per week. Um, then that book, I forgot what his name was, and he talked about how you need 10,000 hours to perfect anything. If you put that number of time, and then becomes more like a skill to you. So this is not just true in craft building and skill building, but I think it's also true in kind of human resiliency building. It's okay to do something more than once, or and I'm sure you're probably the type of person who's reread a book, right? Our relationship with books, even, or with intellectual material, which we, I think, inherited from our school days, is like, okay, you read the book, you get what's in it, do the test, and you're done. In my teaching, for example, I tell people that the book is it's your friend. You're making sohbah with the book. So all I'm doing as a teacher is I'm facilitating the introduction between you and the book. You're going to be on your own. You're going to have this relationship with the book, whether it's a very sacred text like the Quran, or for other people the Bible, or whatever it might be, or it's something secondary to that. But nonetheless, that book becomes your companion, and you go back to it and you reread it and you think about things in it, and then you make connections between that book and another book, and so forth. The same thing if you do something physical like a daily walk. You may walk the same route every day, but every time you may see something different or realize something different on that route, whether it's an urban route or it's a route in a park landscape, but you may see something different. And I think it's just our inability to see, right, to observe, that we haven't really, that's a skill in of itself. And then invariably people will take their phone on their walking route or take the phone at the gym. I don't know how many times I see people at the gym with the phone and they're just sitting on the machine and they're not doing anything. They're just looking at their phone. So I think that's I think we have to address that aspect in terms of boredom, and realize that rather than you are waiting for this some sort of digital stimulant to come, you look at your source of, let's say, interest or stimulation or creativity as the world around you, outside of this mediated, orchestrated reality that other human beings have constructed for you, and not in your best interest, but only so that they can commodify your attention, as we said earlier. But the natural world, whether you have a fervent belief in God or you don't, there is something sublime and bigger than us aspect, bigger than the human condition aspect of everything around us. And so, I encourage people to engage and interact with that environment, with that world around them, in a manner that then they will see things interesting, and it'll spark their creativity, and they'll think about things, and you know. But
Yeah, yeah. So can I pick up on something that you said there,
yeah,
which is in terms of the routine? So it strikes me that some of that almost feels like people are going through the motions, right? And they're missing the depth, right? Oh, I read the book. Oh, I did this walk. Oh, I did the. So could you just say something about that? Because I feel that there's something there in terms of we're missing the depth of what you get from routine when you do something again and again and again, the depth of it rather than just the transaction side. I feel there's
yeah.
something
I think
there.
it's not a transactional activity. It's actually, you can make it a devotional activity, right? And one of our good friends and teachers, Hamza Yusuf, he called it sacred monotony. So we tend to equate something monotonous with something quite boring we don't want to engage in, but there could be something sacred about it. And pre-modern people, routinely engage in things like this, and it wasn't always necessarily a religious activity. It could have been anything. If they had a farm, they'd have to tend to their animals. They'd have to tend to their crops. Even people made a regular activity of visiting other people. The Prophet ﷺ, he had a regular activity of visitation, of who he would visit on what day and when he would go, and these sorts of things. And so it's like, I think it also adds structure to your time, which help you manage that aspect as well. And then you kind of open yourself up and say, okay, I wonder what's going to happen today on my walk. Let's see what turns up. And there's kind of a curious thing about that. And I think if people just open themselves up to that particular aspect, that particular scenario, then they'll find that they'll be pleasantly surprised. And speaking of which, of repetition and growth and so forth, a lot of people engaged in making of crafts and craftsmanship, and they honed their skill set, and they would have to do a certain number of hours per day, even in developing that. And I think that's become quite the lost art. But I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about that. How can people like wean themselves off their digital device and free up time and prevent boredom? Maybe taking up a craft. I wonder if there are any suggestions you have in that particular regard.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think that's really interesting what you said, and the sacred monotony is something that's it's a lovely phrase. Um, Yeah, I think the question is, if people wean themselves off their digital devices, suddenly you have all this time. Well, okay, what am I going to do with it? Right. So then it might be worth thinking about taking up a craft. And there's a quote from a book I'd just like to mention. There's a chap called Gary Rogowski, who's a furniture maker in Portland, Oregon. And he wrote a book called Handmade. so handmade. And I'll quote from the book, and he said that, people have the need to put their hands on tools and to make things. We need this in order to feel whole.
Mm.
And then he goes on to say that, many people experience the world largely through a screen now. We live in a world that is working to eliminate touch as one of our senses, to minimize the use of our hands to do things except poke at a screen. Okay. Now he's a traditional furniture maker, and it's a wonderful book, which really is kind of just reminding us that the taking up a craft, whatever that craft might be, actually does connect you to something deeper, something much more satisfying than someone else's mediated content that's coming to you. And I remember I was reading one study, and I was in the British Journal of Occupational Therapy, and it was about knitting. Now, I know people are going to say, hang on, what are you're two guys talking about knitting, but just bear with me, It's quite interesting. So there's a study on these knitters, and there's about 4,000 people who are knitting worldwide. And what the study was looking at, it was looking at what were the benefits of knitting at an individual and a social level. Were there kind of any therapeutic benefits? Now, the majority of the people who were in this knitting study were female, and they often reported that when they were knitting, they actually felt really relaxed. It was a stress relief, and they actually felt more creative. Now, I know in the case of my mother, whenever she goes on a flight, she takes out her knitting and she starts knitting, right? And she actually feels very relaxed as she's knitting away. And it creates quite a conversation with people sitting on the flight around us. Oh, you're knitting, So I know, certainly from her experience, but also from the study. And what the study showed was that there was a significant relationship between knitting frequency and feeling calm and happy. So people who were frequent knitters actually reported higher cognitive functioning. So what they reported was that knitting, actually, when they were knitting, they had a higher level of happiness and improved sort of social contact and so on. And so the research actually concluded that knitting was contributed a lot to sort of well-being and so on. So that's kind of an example of a craft. Likewise, if you look at sort of popular culture, and of course there are the traditional crafts like furniture making, steel work, metal work, tile work, calligraphy, writing, poetry, horticulture. So there are all those kind of crafts that I would encourage people to take up. But I'm just giving some other examples which are perhaps less thought of. And likewise, if you look at the resurgence of board games amongst people, board games are coming back as well. And I know when I was in Toronto, there was a cafe there called, I think it was called Snakes and Lattes, and it would regularly have a queue of people wanting to get in to play board games and have their coffee. And one of the reasons I think researchers find really interesting about board games is that when you're playing a board game with a bunch of other people, you're exposed to their emotions, their feelings. You scrutinize, body language. You see if they're bluffing. Do they genuinely have the upper hand or not? So this kind of really interesting social dynamic is happening, which helps you really, think things through. And so what I think, people who've worked on this kind of area of research, they say that in order for, say, like a game to be really beneficial and not just be a waste of your time, or a craft, it needs to involve really spending some time with other people as well. So you do something in a social environment. There's some social interaction as well. So that way, then the people who are involved in the craft, what they do, they bring a certain knowledge to the craft. Then there's a social interaction in the craft. There's a narrative of the craft, like this is what we're doing. There are certain decisions you have to make, so it's almost like a strategy. And then there's the actions, like what did we do? So there's a bunch of things happening there. So I think thinking about a craft is certainly something I would recommend to myself and to others as well. But yeah, so that's, I think, a few kind of that's certainly some thoughts on craft there. But I'd just like to sort of come back to you on something as well, which is uh, when we think about some of the craft or some of the leisure activities that perhaps people did before in earlier generations. What were those things? You know, what did people really engage with?
That's an interesting question, Rehan. And just to go back, we said earlier, snakes and lattes. I think there was a board game called Snakes and Ladders. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, or
Yeah,
Shoots and Ladders, something like that. So
yeah, yeah.
that was one of the early board games we used to play as kids, maybe, several decades ago. But anyway, so I think, well, let's look at modern sports, for example, and how what the origin is of that. And where you hail from is probably the number one originator of many of the sports that people play today. So football or soccer obviously originated in England, and cricket, and American football is a derivative of actual football that's played with the foot, and so forth. And my understanding that these activities were there for soldiers to stay fit in peacetime. Um, Short of that, and even modern dressage, the equine dressage and other things also were to keep them fit, and keep them ready for battle in peacetime. And so in the pre-modern world, I think there's always this idea that you have to have people ready to defend their homeland, and defend themselves, and they have to be in a particular level of fitness to do that. And I was just thinking about what you said earlier about handmade, and that people have maybe a spiritual, psychological, emotional need to be doing things with their hands and working with their hands. Um, and I think marrying those two ideas together, I think pre-modern people, especially let's say the prophetic period, from what you read of the seerah, what you read of the hadith, it appears that they did engage in these type of activities to keep themselves ready, in a state of readiness, not just for meeting a physical enemy, but I think also to keep the mind sharp, to keep the body fit, as if those are objectives in and of themselves. So we know that the Prophet ﷺ wrestled with other people. He had a camel that was the fastest camel. When people would race that camel, they had camel races. And then one day, this camel of his lost a race. And then the companion said to him, we never thought that your camel would lose any race. And then the Prophet ﷺ responded back, well, he said, well, that's the dunya. Everything has an end. It's never permanent. So even there were moral lessons in the activities they engaged in. And we know he had, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, foot races with his wife, Aisha, and they engaged in archery and obviously equine activities. And they'd go hunting. They'd go for walks. They travel for trade. So there was this kind of flurry of activity that was not just to make their livelihood, but also the idea of you being more of a complete human being by engaging in these activities. And I think that's something we've lost. As you said, with our hands now, we just touch a screen and point to things on a screen. And everything's become commodified now. Even I think our diets have a lot to do with that. The manner that we eat, the way that we eat, the things that we eat, the times that we eat. People have often very late meals, and then that disturbs their sleep. Then they wake up in a lethargic state. Then they have to keep themselves artificially stimulated with caffeine. And so it's kind of a whole cycle of things. And so I think we mentioned this in our previous sessions, but really, even in terms of managing our time, we have to look at things holistically and not just say, okay, I'm not really making good use of my time. Well, what's your diet like? What's your energy level like? What do you reflect on? What do you contemplate? Have you read any books recently? What interests you in terms of books? And so we've become kind of these products, literally products of what this orchestrated and mediated, digital screen existence wants us to be. And we've become the product. Rather than buying the product, we've become the product. And so we fit into the mold of what the perfect consumer looks like. And that's how they look at us, as consumers. There's producers and there's consumers. There's content creators and there's content consumers. So this kind of dichotomy of producers and consumers, it really hasn't changed much from the idea of the haves and the have-nots. But we can break from that cycle, and we obviously cannot recreate the past, and we can't go back to things that were in the past. And I'm not an advocate of, let's say, going completely off grid and then, making your own crops, sewing your own clothes and things like this. I think that would be an interesting exercise to do as like a retreat sort of thing, and do it for a few days. But I don't think society is going to be able to function if people were to do that en masse. I mean, we're not going back to that. But I think what we could do in lieu of that is look at the perspective and adopt some of the attitudes that people used to have in terms of, the courage they had in confronting their own, lack of discipline and inability to manage their time effectively, and, summon a little bit of that in a way so that we can be more effectively take back control of our attention, take back control of our time, take back control of deciding what really is going to be interesting and stimulating for us, rather than let someone else decide what that is for us. And that requires, like you said, a community. You do it with others, then it becomes much easier to do. Then it becomes something that will be facilitated. So, but we're, like I said earlier, we have this constant threat and assault, and it's just kind of like a constant fight. And I have to admit that sometimes we win and sometimes we don't. So I don't know, Rehan, are there any practical steps you would suggest for people? Yeah, and if they want to go this path to protect their leisure time from, from falling back into these cycles?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, no, thank you. I think there's some really interesting thoughts that you put there about how people use their time before, and also, I guess, the barakah in their time, right? So when they were doing something, uh, actually, what were they doing when they were doing that? So, for example, if someone was cooking, whilst they were cooking, were they doing dhikr as well at the same time?
Mhm.
Or you going for a quick, fast coffee or cup of tea, or actually are you taking time to actually make that in and give the process its time and put barakah into that process as well? So I think it's some really interesting things that you said there that a person can draw from that. In terms of the practical steps, I think, yeah, look, if we get to a point where we can replace some of the digital distractions around us and we have more leisure time, then if we don't replace the void, we have a lot of time now. If we don't replace that void with something meaningful, then what will happen is we'll go back to the digital distractions again. So then we have to really think about, how am I going to renovate my life? What am I going to do to fill that void? Because I think what's quite difficult for a lot of people, it's just to be with themselves. If you just say to someone, just sit and look out the window and contemplate, I think people are going to struggle with that, right? And it's not for everyone. So then, what are some practical things you can do? Well, I've got a couple of things that I'd like to suggest. And this is advice for myself as much as it is for someone else. Number one, you could actually repair or construct something. Do something with your hands. Yeah, if you haven't done this before, start with something simple. Learn how to maybe repair the tire on your bike or something. Build a small coffee table for your living room, right? Learn the basics of some kind of instrument. Now, you might think, well, how am I going to learn this? It's really difficult. Where do I find? You know what? Actually, for this, YouTube is actually really good because there are genuinely thousands of enthusiasts out there who will give you some step-by-step guide of how to make a coffee table, or how to make an ottoman, seat or something as well. So I think there are things like that you can, repair, construct something. And what you'll find is that when you start doing that, and when you get into that state, yeah, you'll learn to be comfortable just being with yourself, being with your thoughts, and working through that, and maybe setting some monthly goals to say, okay, I'd like to try and make this thing or do this thing, by this time. So that's, I think, number one, is find something that you can do with your hands, that you can learn a new skill. I think the second thing is to protect that time, right? To say that, okay, I'm actually consciously making a decision that I'm going to allocate so much time to do this thing, right? And at the same time, while you do that, maybe don't go cold turkey on all the digital distractions, because again, you're going to find that really difficult just to say, I'm not doing that, stop. Rather, give yourself a bit of a timer and say, do you know what? I think I only need for the whole week, I probably need like 30 minutes to be on social media. That's it. Right. And that's something that the big social media companies are terrified that you'll come to that conclusion, because really that's all you probably need. You only need about 30 minutes per week. Check your LinkedIn, check this, check that, whatever, you're done. But for them, that's like that's a disaster scenario, because the more you're on the platform, it's good for them because they, that's their revenue model, advertising. But for what's better for you is to be much more discerning with your time. So I think, protect your leisure time. Don't let the distractions eat into it. Also plan your time, right? So think about a particular goal that you're going to set yourself. So for example, you want to start playing tennis again. You used to play tennis a lot before and you think, I need to get back into this, right? Yeah, you could start playing tennis, but you might want to think about, well, maybe I need to get a little bit fit first as well. How am I comfortable walking for 30 minutes? Can I walk for an hour? Can I maybe jog a little bit? Could I do some kind of light workout? And what you'll find is that, when you start doing these things to help you play tennis, your tennis will start to become more serious and you'll start to change the way you're eating. Maybe you think, you know what, I actually need a goal for my tennis, that I'd like to enter a tennis tournament perhaps in 6 months' time. Yeah, give yourself a goal to work towards. And as your time then starts to fill up with you becoming a tennis player, whatever age you're at, whatever your skill level, again, you'll find you won't need the digital distractions, right? You're moving away. And all that digital stuff will just seem utterly frivolous, trivial, and a complete waste of time because you found something else, right? But again, you need to work yourself into that thing. And the last thing I'd probably say is all of those things, all of the above, try and do them with a community. Try and do them with people, right? It could be a local sports league, a hobby group, it could be a religious community, it could be a board game community, whatever it might be. But when you're doing something with other people, that actually immerses you in those social connections, makes you feel much happier as well. So I think there's a few things there that I would probably again suggest to myself and just to suggest to anyone listening as well. Right. I think we're kind of like drawing to a close. I think there. I don't know if you wanted to come back, if there's anything that you wanted to just pick up on, last thoughts before we maybe go to some kind of book recommendations.
Well, that was very thorough list of recommendations and thinking about them and putting them into practice. And I think you touched on something also that I think is important, that when you try to fill up that leisure time with something interesting and activity, um, it would be good to find something that you can do that you yourself, you can build yourself into it, right? Like if you want to be a tennis player, then you can go into some tournaments or a club league or something like that, or if it's football or whatever the activity might be. And then you actually have a community that's there already that's doing that sort of thing. And it'll actually make it more interesting, and you'll be more excited, and you'll have a new set of friends and a community that you can, converse with on that level. And if you do a couple of these, let's say you start writing and you want to join a writing club, then you get into the writing community. So, and I think this is, in our world today, this is where the interesting things are happening. And I think the majority of the population is, like you said, just mired in the whole digital landscape and is not really being exposed to that. But if one is able to join some of these other communities, and then you learn something from them, and maybe you can add something to it. So I think that's a good start, inshallah.
Yeah, no, great. No, thank you. And on that note, is there, as we kind of round to an end of our shows, we always try and recommend a book as well to listeners. And is there a particular book that you would recommend today, and why perhaps?
There's a book I read many years ago, and I was just starting to study. It's original Arabic, has been translated in English, however. It's called The Value of Time, with among scholars, but I think it also works for everybody. And Sheikh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda, who is a contemporary scholar, passed away years ago, rahimahullah. But in it, he talks about how and brings anecdotes and examples of how people used to spend their time, and even the importance of the time, and people would be on their deathbed and they would still be you know reading or correcting things and looking things up, and that's how putting the value and importance in the time itself. And I remember one particular story. He said that sometimes this person would come visit me and it would just kind of like be a drag to visit. So that's when I would sharpen my pencils so as not to waste my time when that person came. So I mean, that sort of thing, to have I think a good healthy attitude about the importance of time. I would recommend that book for people. And it's available in English, called The Value of Time. Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda, rahimahullah.
Okay.
Any books or materials on your side?
Yeah, I think an interesting work of fiction, more for us to sort of to think about the modern world, is a book by E.M. Forster called "The Machine Stops." And "The Machine Stops" is a novella. I think it was written about 1909, and it talks about a time in the future, many thousands of years ahead, where human beings live in underground kind of almost like a hive. They live in room, but they're all in separate rooms. They're not together, although they're in this underground facilities together, but they don't actually talk to each other. Everyone's in a separate room by themselves, and their entire time is spent in leisure, right? So everything that you need is in that one room. Your bed, your everything, your food comes to you. All your channels are available to you. What you watch, what you listen to is available to you. There are these kind of early video screens. Remember, this is written in 1909, but he's talking about how people can communicate across the world through seeing each other and listening to each other. And your whole time is spent in leisure in this one room. And the thing that you're discouraged to do is to meet people and to talk to people. And you're discouraged to read. And the only book that you're encouraged to read is the manual of how to use the machine, because it's called The Machine Stops, right? And that's the only thing you have to read. The manual of how to use the machine, what lever to pull, what button to poke, what button to press, or what, as we would say, what to scroll and what to sort of, click and so on. That's the only thing you have to do. That's the only book you need to read. So you know how to operate this mega machine that you're inside, that governs your relationship with the world. New ideas are frowned upon, and everything is just regurgitated by the machine. And the machine mediates everything. You talk to people through the machine, it mediates that. Who you procreate with is mediated through the machine. It makes a decision that happens. And so the story is about this one particular mother and son, and the son wants to meet his mother. And he's not satisfied. She lives on a different part of the world and she lives somewhere else. And he says to her, I don't want to speak to you through the machine. I want to see you. And she's like, it's such a hassle. I have to come to you, fly to you in an airship. Then we have to meet and I have to go outside and see the sun. I'm very happy spending my time here in this, and so on. And so it's this journey about this mother to find her son and so on. And in the end, one day, the machine stops working. That's why it's called The Machine Stops, right?
Mm.
And guess what? No one knows how to fix it. So the whole thing falls apart, right? So it's a really interesting kind of reflection for many of us in the modern world, that if you get into a point in time where your leisure time especially is mediated by the machine or modernity or AI or by big tech, whatever label you want to give it. But if you live in a world where everything is mediated by that, a point will come where you will be utterly unable to do anything.
True. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that could be another intention behind some of these activities, that, if and when or whatever something stops working, things run out, oil is no longer being produced, where the dystopian scenario is, at least you'll have a way to still engage with your life.
Yeah, 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 indeed, indeed. Great, great. Thank you so much, Dr. Waleed, for this discussion on leisure time. I do hope our listeners also found something engaging from our discussions. And we'd like to thank you very much for listening. And till next time, peace be upon you.